War is a disaster, and World War II remains the biggest disaster in all of human history. If we break the conflict down into its constituent battles, it quickly becomes apparent that many of them were disasters in themselves, for one side at least. It's hard to say exactly why some battles ended in disaster, as there are a great many factors involved, but sometimes it came down to sheer incompetence. Today, we're going to outline 5 disastrous military operations of the Second World War, focusing on how incompetence came into play. In the first Arakan campaign, fought between 1942 and 1943, some 5,000 troops of British and British Indian armies became casualties of war, mostly because they weren't prepared for it. Earlier in 1942, the Japanese had driven the British Empire and Chinese out of Burma and captured much of the country, including the Burmese state of Arakan. The 1942 to 1943 Arakan campaign was one of the Allies' first attempts at taking a piece of Burma back, though the Japanese had woven themselves tightly into the jungle, and the Allies were repelled over and over again and ultimately forced to retreat. To start with, most British and Indian soldiers had not been trained to fight and survive in the jungle, which sapped them of their health and morale. Compounding this, when the Allied units in Arakan sustained casualties, the men sent to replace them were even less experienced, with some having not even completed basic training. Lessons were learnt, however, and when British General George Giffard took command, superseding General Noel Irwin, the morale and effectiveness of the Allied units in Arakan improved. Factors other than incompetency which contributed to the Allied defeat in the campaign include overburden on Command HQ and poor supply routes. In August 1942, the Allied amphibious raid on Dieppe in southern France became a German laughingstock, only exacerbated by German propaganda. Propaganda or not, the Allies, well, mostly the Canadians, paid dearly for their incompetence that day, when they charged headfirst to a heavily defended port with little knowledge of what they were up against, no artillery support, and no jump on their enemy. To put this disaster into perspective, of the 5,000 Canadians who conducted the raid, more than 3,360 became casualties of it in just 10 hours. While some may point the finger at the Canadians, it's clear that this defeat was orchestrated by high-up command, which failed to see how conducting a frontal assault on a heavily entrenched German position was a bad idea. British General Louis Mountbatten, largely in charge of the Dieppe Raid, held a more optimistic view, stating, "I have no doubt that the Battle of Normandy was won on the beaches of Dieppe. For every man who died in Dieppe, at least 10 more must have been spared in Normandy." Either way, the cost of this lesson was heavy. Another Allied disaster was the Battle of Singapore, in which some 80,000 Allied soldiers fell into the hands of the Japanese, who boasted just 42% of the Allies' manpower on the island. While some point the finger elsewhere, much of the blame falls on the man in charge of the island's defense, British General Arthur Percival, and his incompetence. Perhaps his single greatest blunder was ignoring logic and advice and establishing the bulk of his defences on the northeast side of Singapore instead of the northwest side, where conditions favoured a Japanese crossing of the Johor Strait from Malaya. To cover the northwest side, Percival sent the Australian 22nd Brigade, which, in a recon mission, found Japanese troops massing on the other side of the strait and radioed for a shelling of the area, only for Percival to refuse it in anticipation of the northeast assault, which wasn't coming. When the Japanese made the northwest crossing, the Aussies sustained heavy casualties, and Percival waited a full day before reinforcing them, to little effect. The Japanese collapsed on the Allied lines, disrupted Singapore's water supply, and conducted air raids on its city centre, pressuring Percival into surrendering to a numerically inferior, atrophying force on the 15th of February 1942. Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita said it was Percival's hesitancy to reinforce the Aussies which cost him the battle. Additionally, most of the island's defences were focused southward in anticipation of an invasion from the sea, and artillery pieces were equipped with armour-piercing shells instead of high-explosive anti-personnel shells. Other factors to consider were Britain's inability, preoccupied as it was in other theatres, to allocate sufficient military resources to Singapore, and a general underestimation of just what the Japanese were capable of. Hitler certainly steered Germany toward victory in the early years of the Second World War, though it's largely agreed that his foolhardy plunge into the Soviet Union is what cost him everything. While the Germans lost other battles in the USSR because of Hitler's incompetence, none were as pivotal as the Battle of Stalingrad, in which one of Germany's best armies, the Sixth Army, was annihilated, and in which Axis forces sustained as many as 868,000 casualties. Stalingrad was never part of the German plan. In July 1942, Hitler took out his blood-fueled pen and rewrote its capture into it himself, sundering German army groups south and proposing one half of it toward the Russian city named after his ideological opponent, Stalin. The symbolic value of occupying Stalingrad was far too great for Hitler to ignore, despite it being a bit of a military blunder. Though Hitler's incompetence didn't stop shining there. During the battle, the Red Army surrounded the German Sixth Army in the ruins of the city, and Hitler, as advised by his generals Erich von Manstein and Hermann Göring, decided against letting the army try to break itself out. Instead, they sat there in the cold and withered away as Göring's Luftwaffe failed to supply them from the air, and as the Soviets tightened the noose. One of the best examples of a World War II military disaster is the fall of France, in which the French and their allies suffered some 2.26 million casualties and lost their country to the Germans in a little over 6 weeks. While the Germans had lady luck on their side, the French defeat was contributed to in no small part by incompetence. The French were ready to fight World War I, but this, unfortunately, was World War II. French military doctrine and leadership was ill-prepared for the lightning-fast Germans. Their strategy relied too heavily on the Maginot Line, which the Germans were largely able to outmaneuver, and they failed to seize the initiative and go on the offensive. Even though Allied intelligence spelled out the German army's intention to roll through the Ardennes, the French passed it off as an impossibility and stuck to their Maginot guns, a decision which proved fatal. All of this points clearly to incompetence and complacency in high-up French command. French General Maurice Gamelin is much to blame for the French army's static and ineffectual defense strategy, and while he was sacked on the 19th of May 1940, the battle had been going on for over a week, and there was little his successor, Maxime Weygand, could do but try for a war of attrition, which, as we all know, also didn't work. It's difficult to speak about the fall of France without at least considering the disaster which preceded it, so here's a bonus example. A week into the September 1939 invasion of Poland, the French initiated the Saar offensive, in which they invaded Saarland, Germany, with 40 divisions, 4,700 artillery pieces, and 400 tanks. Instead of striking with a superior force while the Germans were distracted, however, they did just about nothing before they retreated into the Maginot Line. After the war, during the Nuremberg trials, German generals Alfred Jodl and Siegfried Westphal said that the only reason Germany got as far as it did in the war was because the French and British didn't strike Germany in September 1939. While other factors came into play, such as a desire for the British to get blood on their hands too and hope for a diplomatic solution, the French failed to take decisive action here due, in part, to military incompetence. The Germans showed the world how swiftly war could be waged, but the French were caught up in a Great War doctrine and opted for a defensive strategy over a game-changing offensive. What ensued was the phony war, the demoralization of France, and then its defeat, or, if you look at it one way, nothing shy of the rest of the Second World War. Of course, these are just 6 examples of military disasters caused, at least in part, by incompetence. But what do you think? Are there other disasters that are more mind-boggling than these ones? Are these disasters actually caused by incompetence, or is it only viewed that way because of hindsight? Let us know all that and more in the comments below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.